west.
Okay.
On the left is the county park.
Okay.
And as you go into the park, one of the first turns to the left, there's some tennis courts there. If you turn around there, we have a garden our members have created. There's all sorts of places that you can go and look and see what goes well with your position. Thank you.
Okay.
And so you have boggy, wet soil, sunny, shade. And so we try to plant, there's one of just totally. Yeah, so much, there's so much to do. So anyways. Well, welcome to the Master Gardeners of Rome County Lunch and Learn program. We've got some information on the screen if you're not familiar with the details. So that we do this every month, and it's a free program, and we're on our little evaluation form, we always ask you for suggestions of things that you'd like to do. So it's are free. Occasionally we have a workshop where there's some type of small charge, but these classes are free. So these are free. I'm very honored to have one of our own, Catherine Kogar, talk to us about bodacious daylilies. But I want to tell you a couple other things before we get there. So hopefully we have some people online. I don't know how to check that. Our operators in the other room. So, but if you're joining us online or here in the room, please feel free to ask questions as we go. And our local expert will gladly tackle it and we'll go from there. So let's see here. Let's let Catherine introduce herself and tell a little bit about herself. And we're very happy to have you today, Catherine.
Well, thank you. All right, my name is Catherine Kogar. I am serving as president of the Master Gardeners of Rome County at the present time. I guess it's true to say I'm a daylily addict. Raise my hand, I'm a daylily addict.
And there's no 12-step program.
And there is no 12-step program. You just dive in and hope you can survive. I have, I guess, about 600 daylilies now, but who's counting? And there you go. So we're going to talk about daylilies, which I think are absolutely bodacious and wonderful. Daylilies belong to the Hemerocallis family. That is Greek to me, but what it actually means is beautiful for a day. Because the trick about daylilies is each flower is open just for one day, hence the name daylily. So we're going to several rabbit holes today. So if you're not prepared to hold on to your hat as the Mad Hatter, then I apologize, but you may end up with kind of the fire hose experience by the end of this. We're going to talk about what a daylily is, a little bit about the history, what hybridizing is all about, talk about what the hybridizers have done in terms of the features and attributes of modern daylilies, and then take a look at that in the framework of what really makes a good daylily for the garden. Talk about cultivation and propagation, pests and diseases, a little bit about maintenance, and then we'll have a look at daylilies in the garden, which is the garden porn piece of this presentation. So daylilies are fleshy-rooted perennials that have sword-shaped leaves and conspicuously colored these days, lily-like flowers. They have 3 petals, 3 sepals, so they're a 6-segmented flower. And as I said before, they bloom only for one day. Daylilies are not related to what we call true lilies. Those are a different flower, a different species altogether. And we'll look at this slide, which will show you the difference between the two. The daylily, as I said before, has a fleshy root, sword-shaped leaves that come up from a central crown. It sends up what's called a scape, which will have several branches and bloom buds on those branches, which then turn into flowers, which then turn into spent flowers, which then turn into seed pods if they've been pollinated. Whereas a lily starts out as a bulb, sends up a single stem, leaves come off the stem, and the flowers are at the very top of the plant. So a very distinctive difference. Daylily people get very upset when you call daylilies lilies. So don't shortcut. Daylilies are daylilies. So let's look at some pictures that illustrate the difference, starting over here. Which one is the daylily? Which one is the lily? Lily's on the left, she says.
Oh, that left. Oh,
This left. All right, this is the lily. You can see the central stem, the leaves coming off. This is the daylily, this is the bloomscape, and these are the sword-shaped leaves. Over here, these two, which is the daylily, which is the lily? All right, let's get this to work. See, I told you sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. All right, so the daylily is the one on the right, the lily is the one on the left, and the upper one, which is which? It's the reverse. The daylily is on the left, the lily is on the right. So we're all clear about being able to tell those differences. Yes, no? Yes, no. Okay. So where have daylilies come from? Well, primarily they are from Eastern Asia. Back in the day, there were about 16 different individual species. They were all very, by today's standard, kind of nondescript and mundane in terms of their coloring and their flower shapes. Those are across the bottom there. They were used primarily as medicinal plants. Also, they were edible, and all parts of the plant were used, the buds, the flowers, the hearts, and the roots. They are high in protein, high in vitamins A and B, and they have a good dose of minerals. So they started out like many things. They migrated from Asia into Europe, from Europe into England, and then from England, the colonists brought them to America. And they came because they're such hardy, durable plants that they could have a little bit of color in the garden without having to spend a lot of effort on maintaining flowers. Hybridizing didn't really kick off until the late 1800s. And I think it runs parallel with all the interest in botany and how, the botanical sciences really came into their own at that point in time. George Yeld is designated as the first hybridizer. Whether that's really true or not, I don't know. But in England, he started this process. It moved then to America with a fellow named Mr. Harrington in the late 1890s, but most notably a gentleman by the name of Arlo Stout at the New York Botanical Garden really got serious about hybridizing. And he created the foundation from which most of hybridizers today build their plants. So by about 1934, there were 23 introducers, most of whom were Americans, and there were 174 cultivars. The term is cultivar as opposed to variety, but you may hear me switch back and forth. And now, according to the American Daylily Society, where these things are registered, there are well over 90,000. So the fact that I have 600 is just a drop in the bucket.
You're on your way, though.
Oh, yeah. So this is kind of what that process looks like. You started out with just your basic orange. Mr. Stout, through his hybridizing program, he got this little, I'm going to call it flame pattern going on this yellow one. Someone else along the way kept going, created an almost white daylily, and now we have one with all sorts of patterning in it. So you can see the progress here has just been phenomenal. Their own at that point in time. So now we're going down the rabbit hole of what these hybridizers have done with the daylily, the simple little daylily. And we're going to look at all these different things: bloom size, bloom sequence, what the scapes, what matters, what counts about the scapes, the habits of the bloom, the shapes of the flower, all things about color, from texture to substance to patterns. So any questions so far? So like many things, daylilies they don't all bloom at once. You have early, mid, and late sequencing. And within that, you can split it into extra early versus early mid versus mid, late, mid-late, very late, and extremely very late. Depending on your climate zone, where in the calendar year your daylilies begin blooming is just going to be based on that. You know, zone 5 daylilies are going to start blooming later in the calendar year than those of us down here in zone 7. Zone 8 are going to bloom earlier even yet. So there are no absolutes about what time of year they bloom. It just is relative to where you are. And not only that, it's relative to your microclimate. Those of us who live on the lake benefit from the lake effect. It kind of broadens out and softens the growing season. Those of us who don't, we have a much more, I guess, extreme climate condition. And so our experience will be different. So you'll hear a lot of variety in terms of when your daylilies start blooming. I have a fellow addict in the daylily world, and while we have a friendly competition, and she's always sending me text messages about what's blooming in her garden. And we have this competition about who has the first daylily to bloom, who has the last daylily to bloom, and she always wins. So, the other significant thing about the bloom sequence is the concept of reblooming. Daylilies are being bred now to bloom either consistently throughout the season or to bloom fairly early and then put on a second bloom at the end of the season. That end of season bloom will not be as vigorous as the first one, but nonetheless, you get some color. So let's talk about bloom size. Again, we have this Goldilocks approach. We have miniature, small, and large. And I think large should be broken up into large and very large because there's quite a range between 4.5 inches and 13. But typically speaking, the larger the bloom, the larger the plant, the taller the plant. The smaller the bloom, you'll end up with a miniature plant as well. Scape height. Scapes are what you might refer to as the stems where the buds are set. So you want scapes to be up above the foliage. You don't want the scapes to be down in the foliage where you can't see the blooms. You also want the scapes to be well branched because that means you get that many more buds. And since they're only good for one day, you want as many buds as you can. But you also want the scapes to be strong enough to hold up all those blooms as they're blooming. So there's been a lot of interest and a lot of effort in working on just the scapes themselves to make a really good plant. Daylilies are typically what we call diurnal. They open in the morning, they close at night. That's what makes them a daylily. But did you know there are also night blooming daylilies? Go figure. But they open in the late afternoon. They will often stay open throughout the night and close in mid-morning, late morning the next day. So not too many of those, but they do exist. Those are often fragrant because they're attracting the night pollinators. Then an extended bloom daylily exists in both worlds, both the diurnal and the nocturnal world, and it just extends the time frame for which the flower is open. Yeah, I didn't know that either. So when we start talking about the surface, the face of the flower, we get into things like texture. You can see from this illustration, this is very ribbed or embossed. Some of the flowers will be creped. You can see the roll around the edges of this daylily. Some will be very smooth. So a lot of variety in terms of texture. Substance refers to the thickness of the flower itself. Some of them are very fragile looking, look to be very thin, but they're still sturdy. And some of them are very thick and leathery. So you'll see some variation there as well. Flower forms. This is probably where most people are familiar with the variety in daylilies. Single flowers like this one are just your standard, a relative term, 6-segmented flower with the variety, 3 sepals, 3 petals. But as you can see from this called wild horses, there's a lot of variation within the simple flower form. This one is a double. And this particular one is what they call hose and hose, where you have kind of the double part of the flower sitting down in the single part of the flower. There are also peony type doubles where it's just an overall doubleness, bodaciousness of petals. This one is a spider, and it is much larger in scale than these other two. The petals are long and thin, ribbon-like. The American Daylily Society creates standards for spiders to be registered. They have to be in a ratio of 4 to 1. So you can see this one, it just kind of barely makes it, but it is a spider. And this one is what they call a UFO or unusual form. And this particular one is a crispate. The petals are twisted and the sepals are pinched and quilled. They get to be very strange looking. They're very interesting. But, you know, I don't know that you want a whole garden full of them. They're really accent plants more than anything else. Color. This is where people really focus a lot. And as I said before, we started out with just a few shades of yellow and orange. And today we are at the place where we have near whites, not a pure white yet, pinks, lavenders, reds, deep purples, all shades of yellow, gold, and orange. And hybridizers, the holy grail for hybridizers in terms of color these days is to try to get a pure blue and a pure white. Most of the whites have a little bit of a yellow undertone or a pink undertone, and the blues, of course, are lavender. They're not a pure blue. So that's the holy grail for hybridizers. There's also color in the throat of the daylily, which is the very center. These are usually some shade of yellow, green, or orangey melon. And then the other piece, when we talk about color, are the stamens. And you can see in this case, the stamens mimic the color of the flower. They start out with the yellow of the throat and then move into the pinky wine color of the petal itself. The anthers are dark. Oftentimes they're absolutely black. So they really contrast with the flower itself. And I think this is a great picture to show how easy it is to hybridize these things, because this is where the pollen is. This is the pistil, or the female part of the plant. And so it's a simple matter for a hybridizer to come in, cut these off, bring in the pollen from a flower that they've selected, and pollinate the pistil. Let the flower, let the plant create seed, and then plant those seeds and see what they get. So that's really hybridizing in a nutshell. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Lily, daylily. When you cut the stamen, does that keep the flower prettier, longer? Is that true?
I don't know the answer to that. I've never heard that.
I've always heard that. And
Well, I think you may be thinking,
definitely.
you may be thinking about deadheading, which we'll get to. You're not talking
You
about.
just clip the stamen and it's supposedly helps that lily stay open prettier longer once that has been cut. I mean, I've been doing that for years. I've had,
So you're talking about the individual flower?
yeah.
Huh. And so-
You're talking about lilies. not daylilies.
Well, yeah, and I was just curious if it would apply to a daylily.
I don't
also.
think so, because a daylily blooms just for one day.
Okay.
So, you know, they've not I don't even know that they've attempted to overcome that programming of blooming for just one day. That,
Well, thankfully, they're pretty prolific.
yes, yes, they are. Any other questions?
Well, then you'd have to change the name of it.
That's right. You have to go all the way back to the beginning. So in addition to color, there are color patterns. A self is a solid, basically the same color throughout. This one does have a little bit of white around the edges. A blend, these are examples of, and I think sometimes this terminology gets to be so detailed that you end up kind of splitting hairs a little bit. But blends and polychromes are very similar in that they are blendings of colors. A blend is a blend of 2 colors. A polychrome is a blend of 3 colors. But as you can see, sometimes it gets a little confusing. Are you talking about 2? Are you talking about 3? But here we go. And this is more of an example of a peony type double, by the way. We get to bitones and bicolors. Again, we're kind of working through the details here. A bitone is 2 shades of the same color, in this case, a dark rose and a very pale pink, whereas a bicolor is 2 different colors, in this case, red and yellow. But as you can see, they alternate the petals versus the sepals, the petals versus the sepals. More color patterns. Now we're into eyes and bands and halos and watermarks. So again, eyes and bands are kind of similar. The distinction is that an eye, the eye zone itself actually extends onto the sepals as well as the petals, whereas a band, it's just on the petals, not on the sepals. They're all eyes to me. A halo is a little bit different. You see, it's more of an outline than a solid band. And then a watermark is very chalky and is a lighter color than the flower itself, and has that watermark look to it. So I think that is well named. So you feel like you're down the rabbit hole yet? And then still more patterning. We end up with edged or picoteed edges, and we've talked about this a little bit already. You see that the different color edging here, and it can be a little bit more, as you see here. I think I've had some pictures of even wider edging. This is an example of how the midrib can be accented. And in this case, it's not only just a color accent, but as you look at these flowers, you can see that it actually stands out. You know, it has a textural difference. It stands out above the base of the flower itself. Diamond dusting is something you see when the sun is shining on the petals and they just kind of glisten like they have just a fine coating of diamond dust on them. So I think that is well named. So these are all things that when you're reading daylily catalogs, they'll talk about these features and just make you salivate about, oh, that one has diamond dusting. I have to have that one. So you can see hybridizers have had a whole lot of fun creating all these wonderful varieties, all 90,000 of them. But which ones do you want in your garden? What does make a good daylily? First of all, you want it to have good vigor. You want it to thrive and multiply without a minimum level of effort on your part. You want the foliage to look good, no matter what the season is. You want the scapes, we talked about this earlier, you want the scapes to come up above the foliage, hold the flowers up where you can see them and enjoy them. When we talk about the flowers themselves, of course you want them to be pretty. And that is the beauty is in the eye of the beholder category. So what's pretty to me might be hideous to you. You want these flowers to be consistent in that they open well, they last all day, and You want them to weather well. You've seen a lot of flowers that just kind of shrivel up if they get rained on. That would not be something you would want in your garden. You want garden presence where they'll blend well with other things in your garden, hold their own within the design of the garden, and a long bloom season. The longer they bloom, the happier we are. Daylilies are really easy. This is one of the reasons they are called the perfect perennial. They will survive in any kind of soil, sun, partial shade, drought, even neglect. But they will thrive if you give them just a minimum amount of care. If you put them in good garden soil with slightly acidic pH, if you water them regularly, especially as they're getting ready to bloom and during the bloom season, a little bit of fertilizer early in the spring and late in the summer will help them set for this year and for next year. And then mulching, of course, helps in a lot of regards. It keeps the weeds down, keeps the moisture in, and it moderates the soil temperature.
So talk a little bit more about watering, because once my plants have been established, I don't water them unless I'm in a drought situation and the foliage looks.
Right. They really don't need a lot of water. What I have noticed over the last couple of years is that May has become a semi-drought month for us. And so I think it helps if you, during those periods of really dry, and especially when they correspond to that period when they're getting ready to bloom, those two things together would dictate that you might want to water under those conditions. But otherwise, I think you'd be fine just letting them do their own thing.
So if you have what you call ditch lilies, just
Yeah.
on the roads, I think, and your yard is full of them, does that mean that it would be a good environment for the fancy daylilies?
I think it does. I think you can make that translation.
Okay.
But if you're going to let your fancy daylilies occupy the same space, be sure you do an excellent job of digging out those ditch lilies, because they send underground roots and you'll have them coming out.
Do the daylilies,
The fancy ones don't do that.
Okay. So you may talk about propagation.
Yeah. Other questions about cultivation? Okay, you can see from the pictures here, you just dig a hole, you kind of spread the roots out, you fill it up. If you're transferring plants within your garden or from your neighbor's garden to your garden and you've dug up a whole plant, you may want to cut the foliage back a little bit, as you see at the very top here, just to get it off to a good start. So propagation, the easiest way to get more daylilies is to dig up your clumps and divide them. The best way to divide your clumps is to take two digging forks, stick them down through the middle of the clump and pull it apart. And the reason for this is because you don't tear up those roots. You know, you can certainly put a shovel in there and slice them, and you'll see people talking about and advising you to take a shovel and slice them up. But I think they recover more quickly. They establish their vigor more quickly if you try to separate them gently, which a digging fork will do. Now, there are some circumstances where they're just so bound tightly together that that's not going to work. And a shovel or a machete or however you can get them cut apart is the best way to go. But you can divide these into as many individual fans as you want, depending on what you're trying to achieve. You know, they will bulk up quicker if you plant 3 or 4 fans together. You'll end up with a bigger clump more quickly. But if you're trying to spread out the goodness, you can divide them all the way down into individual fans and spread them out that way. Are you familiar with proliferations? Okay, on the scape, for some daylilies, not all of them, you'll see a funny little sprout of leaves growing out of the scape. and that's called a proliferation. And after it has finished blooming, you can cut that off. You can set that down in water and it will root and it will create, it's a clone of that same cultivar plant. So that's another way to get more plants. You can save the seed, but they won't be true to the parent. But you can have a lot of fun with that. As I said, you can even do some hybridizing yourself and get into that whole planting of seeds that you've hybridized for and create your own line should you be so inspired. Yes, ma'am.
How do you plant those seeds? You just like put it in a hole?
Yep. You just, like you plant any other seed, you may want to start them out in a what I'm going to call a regulated area where you can monitor them and see what they're doing. Usually they have to grow 2 or 3 years before they'll make flowers and you can see what you've got. But yeah, you let them dry and then you just plant them out the next spring.
When do you do the division of clumps? Like what time of year?
The best time to divide your clumps is either in the early spring or late summer, early fall. That way they have time to recover in the spring and perhaps bloom that same year. And the fall is the absolute best because then they've got the whole winter to get themselves established.
So ditch lilies will send out roots and that'll kind of overtake things, but the true daylily, you put one plant in and it's going to spread some.
It will spread some, and what they tend to do is they don't spread in terms of runners like a ditch lily will. The clumps will just get bigger. So that's their definition of spreading. And you can tell that it's time to divide your daylilies, obviously when the clumps are bigger than you want them to be, or when the bloom, they're not blooming as lushly as they were because they get crowded, just like daffodils. They get crowded and they need to be divided so that they can go back to blooming. Other questions? Okay, you see the word mutilation up here, and it refers to this section of the daylily structure. These are the roots. This little area, this line here is the crown, and these, of course, are the leaves coming out of the crown. What hybridizers and propagators will do is they will scoop out the crown and they will treat that with a chemical called colchicine, and they will then do tissue cultures to propagate hundreds and thousands of daylily plants. This is why there's so many stelladoras out there in the world, because they do it in that way. Daylilies are typically what they call diploids, which means in this case they have 22 chromosomes to play with. Hybridizers have figured out how to turn them into tetraploids, which give them 44 chromosomes, so they have double the goodness, double the fun. And tetraploids are usually a little sturdier, a little more vigorous. The flowers are a little more vibrant. There are people who really like working with what they call tets versus dips. Yeah. Pests. So you see the term here, regular garden stuff, aphids and spider mites. You might have some voles chewing away at your crowns. You might have a few slugs and snails eating the leaves, but the number one critter pest in the daylily world is deer. And you can try anything and everything. One of the best things is a dog. So the sprays are very effective. They smell bad and they keep the deer away, but you have to be really religious about getting out and spraying on a regular basis because the rain washes it off and you have to get back out there and do it again and again and again. But it does work.
So the ditch lilies, I've never had a deer come near.
Yeah.
And so if I let the ditch lilies do their thing,
Well, this is,
Do they deter deer?
this is my current experiment. This is my current experiment. I have a daylily garden that's roughly the same shape as where you're sitting, this kind of U shape. And so around the perimeter of that, I have planted ditch lilies. The logic being they will encounter the ditch lilies and be satisfied and leave my good lilies alone.
How's it work?
Well, it's too new to tell. But I really don't have a whole lot of faith that will.
So it's not that the ditch lilies deter the deer?
No, my thinking is they satisfy the appetite, but I don't think that really holds true. An electric fence can be effective if you have a place where you can set one up. But just, if you're going to get into the daylily world, understand that you have to have a strategy, at least in this part of the world, to contend with deer.
Okay, so what if you have the voles, the slugs, the snakes, and the deer eating your daylilies? What do you do then?
Then you might want to think
Stop
about
showing up.
grow something else.
You should come get my, wandering Jew.
Yeah. Usually snails and slugs, I have not seen that is a horrendous problem here.
Not with daylight,
Yeah, I have.
Okay.
under daylight.
They're going after my houses and my daylilies.
Yeah.
So I go out there every morning and do a little pick and stomp, pick and stomp.
Yeah. And
We have slugs and snails both.
have you used slug bait?
I have not tried that. Someone said to crush up eggshells, and when they go over them, they
Yeah.
get cut up.
Yeah.
And I tried the beer in a pan. That does attract a lot of them. And it does. Some of them want to leave the party early, so I have to go out there, and then again, I have to grab and squish them.
Yeah.
And then we have the voles that are eating the tops, and then the deer, whatever left, take care of the rest.
So castor beans, if you grow a stem castor beans, will deter
Balls.
voles.
Yeah.
Okay,
And I can't usually find the starts around here, but I literally pick the beans and replant them every year.
okay.
So I have not had a problem in a couple of years, but those are really poisonous.
They're poisonous to,
Dogs and.
yeah, but I don't see other critters eating them. I mean, like
Yeah.
pets, but
Yeah.
that's not to say they wouldn't. And they're very architectural. They're beautiful plants.
Okay.
They're very dramatic. No.
I had a few come back. Yeah, I had a few come back, but most of the time I put the seeds where I want them.
Yeah, I don't have them self-seed. I have to save the seed and winter them over.
I've had a couple of seeds, but
Yeah, not very many.
But the seeds are very easy to pull out. So
Okay.
it's very obvious.
And then just save it in the spring, replant again.
Yeah, yeah. So there is a disease called daylily rust that was introduced into the US in the early 2000s, but it requires a host plant as well. And that is rarely grown in the US. So daylily rust, while you will hear it talked about, it's not very common.
What is that? Is it little spots on your?
Yeah, your leaves,
Look like
your,
you're drying up.
yeah, your leaves will get the spots and
I
they're
have
very
that.
risky. But
I'm a great gardener.
daylily leaves will look old and worn out and aged, but it's not necessarily daylily rust.
Okay,
It's just abuse in the garden.
all right.
Sometimes you'll see a little bump on the flowers before they open up, and that can often be mites or thrips or aphids, and so a systemic insecticide will help with that. There is something called spring sickness. The cause of it is unknown, but it can cause your crown to rot. So if you see your crown rotting, I would suggest that you dig that plant up, put it in a plastic bag, put it in the garbage. And then there, of course, are nematodes. Again, not very common, but you will see them from time to time. Often that's part of what's causing this rot. So another reason to dig those plants out and not try to save them. So routine maintenance. These are things you can do, but you don't have to do. There's a lot of discussion about whether deadheading, in other words, taking off the spent blooms, makes a difference in terms of the vitality of the subsequent blooms. There are people who think that if you deadhead, it allows the ongoing blooms to remain big and bodacious. There are other people who say it doesn't make a bit of difference. It certainly makes your garden look better. You don't want all these shriveled up, dead looking, bits and bobs laying around, sitting around. So I try to deadhead, but some years I do better than others. And if you're trying to photograph your daylilies, by all means deadhead, because your photographs will look much better. You can pull off the seed pods. That will cause the plant to put its energy into growth as opposed to making seeds. You can cut out the finished escapes. That will make it look more neat and tidy. Trim back the foliage if you're so inclined. If you've got some die-offs and dead stuff accumulating in there, just cut it out. And then in the winter, it's always a good idea, this is late winter, early spring, to rake out, clean out your beds.
In the fall, do you put everything back?
You don't have to, but you can. I tend to not cut my things back in the fall because it creates a little bit of protection, insulation for the plants. I will wait and do that in the late winter, early spring.
So after they bloom, I've got to where a lot of my leaves do start to dry up, and I'm out there pulling off the dead.
Yeah,
Do that throughout the year and then just get those out. That's just normal. That's not a
Yeah.
plant to stick or die.
no, that's just normal.
You take that off your problem list.
One less thing to worry about.
And then if you have an abundance of daylily buds or daylily plants, you can harvest them and bring them into the kitchen. And when I went out and looked at recipes, it was typically things like fritters or tempura or stir fry. So if you're intrigued by this, I encourage you just to Google, daylily recipes and try some of them. But since the beginning of daylily time, they've been used as edibles. So
Have you?
I have not.
Okay.
I have not.
Good.
What do they taste like?
They're crunchy and they have a mild flavor. They're not strong, but they're just pretty. And
Yeah.
like on a salad, just have they warm in the middle of it. Just come right.
It's a great idea.
So now we're just going to look at pretty pictures. So questions about all this other information I've thrown at you?
So one of the things I'd like you to talk about for a minute is your concept of the way you do your color.
Okay.
So I'm gonna talk about Catherine's garden for a second. When you go and see her daylily garden, she's an artist and she's got this eye about the way she has the color of her daylilies flow. So would you speak to that just briefly?
Does she have a photograph of?
Well, my photographs of my garden don't, and I will say this, they don't do justice to the garden. And it's hard, when your garden is shaped like this, it's hard to get the whole thing in here. But to Donna's point, I go through the color wheel with my color. And my yellows blend into reds, blend into dark kind of cranberry reds, blend into peaches, blend into pinks, blend into lavenders and purples. So there's this sweep of color as you survey the garden as the big picture.
And have you created your own color? Have you tried to do your own cross to
No.
kind of create something?
No, with 90,000 different options out there, I feel like I don't need to spend my time doing that.
You could have that one color that no one has
I
ever seen.
could.
So when you do that, did you also take into account bloom time or did
Yeah.
they all bloom at
Yeah.
the same time?
Yeah, no, I have little pockets. So I have, let's talk about my yellows for a moment. I have my early yellows grouped together. And then within my early yellows, I'll have some of my mid-zone yellows mingled in so that there's a blend of timing. And then those will blend into the late yellows.
You also do it by height too.
And I do it,
Tall, medium,
I do
short.
tall in the back, medium and short in
Okay.
front. So there are a lot of moving parts when you start thinking about designing. And
When you walk through the garden with Catherine, she'll say, oh, that one was a little taller than I thought it would be, I'm gonna have to move that. Or then she adjusts her color. I've been going to her garden for a couple of years now. And it's very pleasing, you know, I mean, she's been doing this for years and the results is better every year.
Yeah. With the exception of this year, I'm sorry to say, I have gotten behind the 8 ball in my daylily garden, and no, really I have. And the deer have had their way with it, and the weeds are taking over. And this is not going to be the year to come see my garden.
So Catherine, where do you purchase? I mean, do you go through catalog? Is there a nursery around here that has a lot of these beautiful daylilies?
I have done a lot of catalog purchases. There's a lot of, over the fence trading with friends. I've been out to Oaks Daylilies, which is what we were talking about at the beginning, and purchased from them.
What is it called?
Oaks, Oakes, Oaks Daylily Farm out in Coreyton, which is north Knoxville, basically the little corner where Knox County and Union County come together. And they have a day, we were talking about this earlier, they have a daylily festival coming up the end of this month. If you go out on their website, they will be promoting their festival. So this picture is our fellow master gardener, Iris Shelton. This is her garden. These are her reds. And you can see she's down on the lake, so she has that wonderful moderating effect. And there's a little bit of yellow in there for contrast. These are examples of using daylilies as edgings or borders. You can see this one is edging what looks to me to be a bank, like a shrub bank. And as it comes down to the lawn, these daylilies provide a very nice accent and transition from one zone to the next. This one along this wall, these are individual clumps of daylilies, but again, the same daylily, the same variety. So it adds rhythm into this garden and a nice finish. These, I'm trying to decide whether they're Stelladoros or something else. I think they're a little taller than Stellas, but they could be Stellas, and they make a nice low border. And I think the nice thing about daylilies is even when they're not blooming, you've got this grassy edging, so it mimics to a certain degree monkey grass or variety and makes a nice neat border.
Kevin, what do you do for fertilizing on your daylilies to get your clumps that big? I've got something I've had for like 4 or 5 years. It's still basically just the one plant.
Well, again, remember we talked about what makes a good daylily in the garden, and vigor is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so some will be more vigorous than others, but basic 10-10-10 is what I use.
Okay.
So you might want to do a soil test, right?
Yeah.
You might have a nutrient in the media kit to do that here today.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they might tell you you need some of
Too
them,
much acid, too much alkaline, too much.
or you might need potash or.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, we're good. So this, I included this picture because I like the combination of textures and colors and plant material. So you got just kind of a simple, basic red and yellow daylily. I don't think this is a ditch lily. I think this is a cultivar. You've got these wonderful red leafed cannas. And then you've got what I think is larkspur. So a very dramatic color contrast here.
Baptista in there too.
Yeah, I think this is, I tried to make this Baptisia, but I don't think so. I think this is the Baptisia, but I think this is larkspur. Just a very nice combination, and you can see it's all interplanted as opposed to a clump of this and a clump of that. And here we have clumps that done very nicely. You've got a grass in the back here. You've got perovskia or Russian sage. See, this thing works for a while and then it quits. And then you have this, what I'll call a small swath of daylily, backed up by this wonderful red leaf shrub. I don't know who that is. And then some threadleaf coreopsis in the front. So you've got a nice alternating, heights coming down to the front. You've got nice variety in terms of color, variety in terms of texture. I just think this is very nicely done. Two different pictures here. This is a white garden, and I don't think it's in our part of the world because these things don't bloom at the same time here. But you got a green and white hosta. You've got a basically white daylily. You've got the white astilbe, and then some hydrangeas in the background. So a very nice look. This is actually my garden, and just kind of a perspective in terms of the flow of color and the flow of shape.
I see the deer stand back there waiting.
Yes, yes.
And you've got labels I see on all of those.
Yeah, yeah, my friend Iris will tell you that she and I together have worked very hard on recreating who my daylilies are. I have lost the names of my daylilies so many times. As Donna was saying, I've been trying to do this for years and years, and there have been good years and bad years. And so there have been years where I've lost the names and then years where I've retrieved the names, and it becomes a vicious circle. But I think I'm finally on top of it, and I know the name, or I can discover the name of all my daylilies now.
So on your garden, as you go down there, you start with a couple of white ones. The pink that I'm seeing there, are those daylilies or is that something else?
So this back here
Yes.
is a drift rose. There's a glare from the light. These are daylilies. These are all daylilies. We should have turned these lights off.
We should have.
So this is another picture off the web. Again, this intermingling. I think these are the wild Kwanzos, which are kind of the double ditch lilies. Are you familiar with those? Okay, there is a variety of ditch lily that the flower is a double, and those are called Kwanzo, Kwanzo. And you can see that they are double flowers. So there's a cultivar here, some hosta here, and just a nice combination of kind of a meadow look. Again, a mixed perennial bed where the yellow daylilies provide nice contrast to the purple of the butterfly bush and the other things in this garden. Daylilies mingled with coneflowers. And again, still that kind of wild look. And here is a mixed board. Well, this is primarily a daylily garden with a few other things blended in, including the cat. But just enough variety to break up all the daylilies. But daylilies by themselves, nothing but daylilies makes a dramatic statement. I just, the thing you have to contend with is when daylily season is over, all you have then is just a mass of green leaves. But it is beautiful when it's in its full glory. Here's another swath along a walkway. Again, kind of semi-shade, doesn't have to be full sun. This, I think, is interesting because this is that no space between houses. And there's a driveway here and a steep wall, and then up to the side, just that tiny little side yard. And they've created a very interesting garden here full of hot colors. The reds and gold daylilies with just a little bit of other things in the blue and purple family to calm it down a little bit. But I think that's a good use of space. This is another master gardener, Aileen Radcliffe. The way she has used, to a large degree, the wild daylilies around her house. So you can see over here, she's mingled them in with yuccas. This is actually wrapping around the corner of her porch. That's why I put these two together. She's used some as accents here. I don't think they're actually growing in these pots, but the pots are nestled up against them. So you don't have to have huge, you can just have small plants and still have an effective, dramatic look. Here she has planted the red daylilies under the blue hydrangea to kind of skirt the plant, which I think is a nice effect. And over here, she again has tucked some of her containers up against her daylilies so that they all work well together. So some good ideas there. And the last one from Aileen is this one. You see these tall ones, grass, and then containers. So a nice effect, I think. This is back to Iris's garden. Nice grass. These are obviously shades of light yellow. I think what is nice here is the way these daylilies are grounded by the shrubs, the grass and the magnolia and the calla lily. They provide, a base, a background, some foundation, so they're not just out there floating in the middle of nowhere. In contrast of the blue Stokes asters with the yellow, shades of yellow, and Jack Maple over here. And this is in my garden. This is another angle of that same view, but you've got the rosy peaches here and the more orangey peaches here, just kind of traveling down the path. Collection of oranges with a little bit of yard art to accent. In case you were wondering whether this is the orange garden, it definitely is the orange garden. And these, by the way, are tiger lilies, so they also bloom orange when they're blooming, and there is overlap in terms of color.
Just a little lantana in there.
Yeah, there's a little bit of lantana.
So tiger lilies are true lilies?
Tiger lilies are true lilies. Yes, let's see if we can go back. You see the distinctive structure. This is what I call my desert garden. It has cactus in it, so of course it's a desert garden, and driftwood. But and another view of that where you get more of the idea of the windswept look I was after. This, by the way, is a thing called retivita, or a Mexican hat, and it's very wispy and blows in the breeze and is beautiful, and it kind of obscures but reveals the daylilies that are intermingled in there. This is my circular daylily garden with cannas. I'm trying to minimize the monoculture aspect of it because it has been nothing but daylilies for a very long time. And now I'm trying to intermingle some other things so that there's something interesting going on throughout the year. So I've added the cannas back here, and there are some azaleas and roses over here. This is a small rose that's getting started, but this is my yellow section. And you see all my labels that Donna's talking about. Most people find those very ugly, and they are, but they serve a purpose. This is across the way, the other side of the garden. This is the lavender section. And that tall, wonderful looking thing is Culver's root.
What is it?
Culver's root, C-U-L-V-E-R-S, Culver's root, yeah. And what I like about this section of my garden is I have a very dramatic evergreen background that really makes the colors of the daylilies pop. That was it. But if you want more information about daylilies, you can't do any better than going out to the American Daylily Society website. It has tons of information. I included this particular piece of information. Their national convention, which they hold every year, is coming up in early July. It's going to be in Asheville, North Carolina. So basically in our backyard this year. So if you're interested, if you've gotten the bug, then go out onto that Daylily Society website and find out what you need to find out to get yourself to Asheville to the national convention.
Well, thank you so much. We have a small token of our appreciation for you. So for those of you who haven't been here before, this is a print that one of our master gardeners, their brother is an artist, and he's shared these prints with us. So we'd like to honor you with that, and thank you for being our speaker today.
Thank you, thank you.
So like we said at the beginning, this is a monthly event. Next month is integrated pest management. And the speaker is Dr. Chris Cooper. He's from the western part of the state, and he's quite the expert. So if you're not familiar with integrated pest management, it's what you do routinely to keep from having some of the big problems. One of the questions we had online was to talk about tomato blight. So part of the problem with tomato blight is environmental things, overwatering, not taking out the dead foliage and so forth. So we hope you'll join us again, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
And by the way, there are